In March, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI issued a joint alert this March, 2018, announcing that Russian government cyber actors were targeting critical infrastructure in the U.S. This wasn't about Russia attacking our elections and political parties. This alert from March was that the Russian government was using its hackers to target America's energy sector, our, quote, commercial facilities, and our nuclear sector. How about Congress hold hearings to investigate that? That seems like a serious thing, and that seems like something Congress could do right now if they were so inclined, if they wanted to help find a way out of this national security crisis we find ourselves in right now. There's a whole bunch of super practical, super specific stuff Congress could do if they're looking for ideas. Here's another idea, free for nothing. Last month in Singapore, President Trump surprised everyone by announcing unilaterally that he had agreed to cancel joint U.S. military exercises between the U.S. military and our allies in South Korea. Now, this is not a concession that he traded North Korea. It's not like he got something from North Korea for that. This is just something he unilaterally offered. We later learned that not only had the president not consulted South Korea about the fact that he was going to make that announcement, he hadn't consulted the U.S. military about that before he made that announcement. We know from Wall Street Journal reporting several months ago that the canceling of U.S. military exercises with South Korea is something that President Trump was actually asked to do by another world leader. According to the Wall Street Journal, Vladimir Putin had asked President Trump to cancel those joint exercises last year in a one-on-one phone conversation. How about Congress holding hearings on that massive policy change and its national security implications, and how that policy change came about? Who was consulted on it? How was the president advised? Where did that idea come from? Several days before that announcement from President Trump, the president again surprised everyone with his announcement that it's the new position of the U.S. government that the G7 should become the G8 again. They should invite Russia to be part of that group again. Never mind all the reasons why Russia was kicked out in the first place. Russia should be back in that international alliance now. That is something that would obviously suit Russia very well, but apparently, again, there's no indication that anybody else in the U.S. government was part of that decision or was consulted about it or even had notice from the president that he was about to make that radical U-turn in U.S. policy and announce it publicly. That's a radical change in an important U.S. policy. How about holding congressional hearings on where that policy change came from? Right? Where did the president get that idea? How were other foreign policy and national security officials in our government involved in that shock announcement? And if they weren't, why not? If Congress is feeling up to it, they might consider holding a hearing on why senior White House official Jared Kushner took a meeting during the presidential transition with the head of a sanctioned Russian bank, who personally has a Russian intelligence background. The White House and that bank have given conflicting explanations as to why that meeting happened, so we don't really know why that meeting happened. I mean, that was a soon-to-be White House senior official meeting with a sanctioned Russian entity, and we don't know why. How about a hearing on that? I mean, yesterday, literally on the same day the criminal complaint was unsealed against a Russian citizen who's accused of using the NRA as a conduit to influence U.S. political leaders on behalf of Russia. Literally on that same day, the Treasury Department and the Trump administration announced new rules that would allow the NRA to stop disclosing its donors to the IRS. Right, amid these red-hot concerns and what appears to be open federal investigations into whether the NRA might have not just been used as a conduit for Russian influence, but potentially as a conduit for Russian money into the presidential election. On that same day, we learned that a Russian spy was being criminally accused of having pulled that off. That's the day the Treasury Department announces, no, we no longer need to have any sort of window into what money is flowing through the NRA and where it came from. I mean, if Congress was looking for something constructive to do here, instead of sending sad tweets, they could set about stopping the Treasury from making that change. At least not till we are clear on what's going on here, right? If they're too scared to investigate anything directly related to the Trump administration, maybe Congress could just be persuaded to investigate themselves a little bit in this scandal. I mean, in the indictment from Friday, all those Russian military officers indicted, prosecutors allege that a candidate for U.S. Congress solicited and received stolen, hacked information from Russian military intelligence about his or her opponent in that congressional election. Reasonably speaking, you might think that the House Ethics Committee could look into a charge like that. especially once it's included in an unsealed federal criminal indictment. Right? The Justice Department is effectively saying that hacked information, presumably from the Democratic Campaign Committee, was stolen by Russia and then used in a congressional campaign because as stolen information, it was solicited by a person who was running in the general election for a seat in the U.S. Congress. Reasonably speaking, you might think that the Ethics Committee in Congress could hold a hearing or two on whether any serving member of Congress solicited that stolen information from Russian military intelligence and thereby knowingly benefited from that stolen information to secure their own election. I mean, that's a person who was in the general election who either won that seat or lost it. If that's a sitting member of Congress, shouldn't the Ethics Committee look into that? Whether or not that person knew it was Russian military intelligence he or she was soliciting the information from, soliciting stolen information to try to win your election, that's illegal, right? Pick one. All of these things are specific, doable, totally within Congress's comfortable wheelhouse. Any of these things could be put in motion at any time. I mean, you and I may occasionally feel helpless as citizens here in the midst of this crisis, but you're in Congress, boy, there's a lot of stuff you could do. Take your pick. I mean, here's another example. One thing Congress has been sort of willing to act on in the Trump era is enforcing and levying new sanctions against Russia, right? Even when the Trump administration objects to that. Well, here's one. Last year, Michael Isikoff reported at Yahoo News with multiple on-the-record named sources that basically in the first days of the Trump administration, they tried to unilaterally get rid of Russia's sanctions. Quote, top Trump administration officials, almost as soon as they took office, tasked State Department staffers with developing proposals for the lifting of economic sanctions, the return of diplomatic compounds, and other steps to relieve tensions with Moscow. It was all done in the earliest days of the Trump administration, unbeknownst to the public. Congress, even this Congress, reportedly does care about sanctions on Russia. How about a hearing on what happened there with the other echelons of the Trump administration, the brand new White House, brand newly arrived in Washington, ordering their first staffers at the State Department to figure out how to get rid of those sanctions on Russia, unbeknownst to the public? How about a hearing on that? Congress cares about sanctions. Do you care about trying to undermine sanctions? I mean, there's stuff to do. We are not beetles on our backs, moving our legs with no way to flip over. There's work to be done here. If you actually want to help this country get out of this national security crisis, your hands are not tied. Getting the truth, getting clarity, holding people accountable, stopping more bad stuff from happening now and in the immediate future, that's at hand. It's not an impossible list. It's practical stuff. The question is whether anybody will do it. Theoretically, none of those things I just mentioned has any partisan cast whatsoever. There's no reason why Democrats and Republicans would not work together on, why don't we have a cybersecurity chief anymore? Why did Russians hack our nuclear industry? Why is a sanctioned banker from Russia meeting with a White House official? Theoretically, none of that stuff has any partisan cast whatsoever. Republicans and Democrats, you could imagine working together on stuff like that. Here in the real world, though, in order for any of that stuff to actually happen, we are probably waiting on Congress to change hands and for Democrats to win control. And tonight you see some of the energy that might fuel that across the street from the White House, where there is now a second day of basically spontaneous protests against the president and him siding with Russia over the American government. You're going to see it with a lot more protests all over the country tomorrow. We also saw it today in a rare sign of rational cooperation by liberal groups of a whole bunch of different kinds of persuasions, a big joint effort announced called The Last Weekend to try to recruit everyday Americans who are freaked out about what's going on in the country. They're trying to make it the largest grassroots effort ever assembled for a midterm election to get people to get out the vote for Democratic candidates, but also to volunteer for Democratic candidates all over the country. And things do feel like they're at a boil right now, which can be scary because hot water is hot. But it can also be useful if it means things are really starting to get cooking. We've got a lot more to get to tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.